My name is Dr. Rick Seguil.
And action. Hey, Jay had a... This is Kirk And action. Hey everyone, it's Dr. Rick. Robbie had a question about nutritional ketosis and diabetes. And I think it's valid to consider. I tried nutritional ketosis, tried to at least get into the adaptive phase. It was tough. My irritable bowel syndrome really flared up, and it's very time consuming as a vegetarian. I was a pescatarian before, went into veganism from November 2018 onward. So it is tough, a lot of calculations, and essentially I was going to be drinking omega-3 or olive oil for the majority of my day, and so it wasn't right for me. But I have a lot of patients that will manifest great results. But if this is the first time you're finding me, don't forget to hit the subscribe button down below and the alert button to find out when I do new videos. So I just did a video on diabetes and FMD. That's fasting, which I think is great. Nutritional ketosis. My patients who maintain ketosis, and I have a handful, I think they're doing great. This is my nut. I just went to work out. This is my nut butter. I don't know if you can see it, but if you look here, grams of fat, 16, I think, right? Yeah, 16 grams of fat. And there's also carbohydrates in here too, and protein. So carbohydrates and protein can induce an insulin reaction, and it'll turn on the pancreas to make insulin. So I think the most important thing, there are a couple of bullet points. I like the work of Stephen Phinney. I don't have his book today, left at home, but I'll put it on the cover, on the thumbnail. But I like the work of Stephen Phinney and Virta Health in Indiana with Hallerberg. But the basic premise with nutritional ketosis is there's a couple phases of getting into ketosis. Now, if you watch my video on FMD, the 6 day on, I'll put a link down below in the specific time. I showed a link to my beta hydroxybutyrate and my insulin levels. If you can get your insulin levels below 1, hopefully in the morning, and get your beta hydroxybutyrate levels above 3, that is ketosis. And I don't think that the urine strips are that accurate. I think in the beginning of your ketosis practice, maybe during the adaptive phase, your urine strips might be good because kidney will secrete a lot to protect. But after a while, it becomes the kidney becomes stingy, and you might not get that great of a reading from your urine. I would always go for blood. Now, if you can go for blood, great. That gets to be a pain in the butt. There are some very expensive strips that you can get. I think they're $1 each until you get balanced. But here's the thing. So, getting your body and your brain and your muscle used to using beta hydroxy ketones as a fuel source is a little bit challenging, especially when we're brought up essentially with using glucose as a fuel source. So it should work. It should switch over. Your body should switch over, but there's going to be a little bit of a rough time when your body switches over strictly that fuel source. And the idea, so we have it built in us to do that as a fail-safe measure, especially with the brain. If the brain says, I'm not getting any glucose because say you're hungry or you are on a desert island or you're in the woods and you don't have anything but water, or in olden days, if you're Cro-Magnon man and there's famine, you're not going to be able to have meat and fuel for a while. Not just meat, but fuel, vegetables, legumes, grains, whole grains, fat. So what happens is the body, the brain especially, will switch over and utilize fat stores. You have fat stores. Visceral fat, unfortunately with most Americans today, is where you keep a lot of energy. But in the expectation that you're going to be hibernating for winter, that never happens. In fact, we always eat more for the winter, so we keep on adding to the battery. That's why America has body mass indexes that are on average overweight. And a high percentage of Americans are obese. And that comes along with high blood pressure, diabetes, and cholesterol, and that leads to heart attack and stroke and cancer. So you can see that if we ignore this problem of being so over-glucosed, you're going to have a problem. So that is one of the bullet points of a well-formulated low carbohydrate practice is you can usually get the fast benefits of satiety and weight loss. I think that's one benefit. A lot of people will start to lose weight quickly because the fuel that you, or the food that you eat isn't necessarily the fuel that you burn up for energy. So what we sometimes, or not we, but what I've seen some keto practitioners do, they switch over their fuel sources and they cut down a little bit on total caloric intake per day. Number one, the cutting of caloric intake per day is helpful because I think we overeat. Number two, I think when you switch over to a fuel source and you become keto adapted, that's when your beta hydroxybutyrate level in the bloodstream is high, like a 3 or higher, or when your insulin level, fasting insulin level is low, or when your glycosylated hemoglobin, that's the 3-month glucose test for most diabetics, type 2s and type 1s, when that drops below 5.7, then you're cool. I think the most accurate test is going to be a 2-hour to 3-hour glucose tolerance test when you swallow 50 grams of dextrose and then you test your fasting glucose and insulin before, at 1 hour, at 2 hours, at 3 hours. That'll tell you if you are insulin resistant or not. So I think the majority of type 2 diabetics are insulin resistant. That's why most of my colleagues put people with type 2 diabetes on medicines. But I think this ketosis practice, or nutritional ketosis, is very useful because number one, it will get you satiety, so you learn not to eat so many carbohydrates, because carbohydrates don't really give satiety. I think we're told in the olden days that if you have a full stomach, you'll be satiated, but how many of you have a full stomach and you keep on eating? Monty Python, there was a skit where this guy kept on eating in the restaurant, and he kept on getting bigger and bigger, and he had one little piece of chocolate and he exploded in the restaurant, and you could see his heart in there, and that was kind of gross, but that's Monty Python. So, but it goes to say that we are used to not being able to stop eating. And so I think number one, we have to get used to not eating, and it's kind of cool when you switch over to a well-formulated low carbohydrate practice, adaptive ketosis. You can eat to satiety. You're going to be eating mostly fats, healthy fats. So that is a little bit different because most of us don't understand that. I think with an average person, and it goes, the formulation or the way you get into nutritional ketosis is different for everybody a bit. There'll be the rules of thumb that you have to have a low carbohydrate level. You need some, depending on if you're an athlete or not. You need to have a low protein level, but not too low so that you lose muscle mass, and you have to have the rest of it all fat. So you can't just, I was teasing my relatives last summer because during the time when I was building my outdoor fire pit, I just eating nothing but fat and animal and whatever Filipino food we had. And I was saying, I'm practicing ketosis, just as an excuse. And eating pork and eating or drinking beer is not ketosis. Eating French fries is not ketosis. Eating French fries is not vegan. But anyway, I like to see my patients have a coach because I think it's a little bit different to divide up your nutrition in the proper manner. Plus, if you have medications, there are some problems when you take certain medicines. Insulin lookalikes, not metformin, but other medicines that you can drop below the deck really fast with regards to your glucose level, and you can go hypoglycemic, which is passing out level. So you have to be careful. That's why it has to be dialed in with your doctor. You also have to be careful because depending on if you're adaptive or your maintenance phase, you might have to, or if you're Herxheimer's, if you're going through Herxheimer's before you even get adapted, you're going to have somebody guide you as far as what to expect, how to change your nutrition practice. If you're an athlete and you're going through this, you have to know how much protein to take. I've seen some athletes go 1.5 grams per kilo or higher, and you got to be careful because protein is necessary for keeping muscle from atrophying. So when you go on a diet of any sort, you'll lose weight. But unfortunately, the majority of times when you initiate that diet and you lose weight, you're losing muscle mass. And you don't want that. You want to lose fat, but it takes a while to click over. So sometimes when you maintain a little bit of exercise and you maintain just the right amount of protein, you won't lose that much muscle mass. So that's why, again, you have to be guided by somebody who's really well versed with what to do. So maybe for my athletes, after you get into an adaptive phase or a maintenance phase, maybe depending on your exercises, especially the endurance guys, you can crank up your glucose, or the high intensity interval training guys, like Orange Theory, you can crank up your glucose depending on what activity you're doing to get through that short burst of type 2 muscle fiber stimulation. But again, if you're trying to do that, you have to really be well guided, because you don't want to do that for your muscle so that you have muscle glycogen, but then instigate an insulin response because you just blew your ketosis. So see, it's getting kind of confusing. But the bottom line here is, Robbie, even if you're diabetic, and even if we don't use that many medicines, honestly, there is some safety to this. But there have to be coaches in the wings just watching over. And as an athlete, you have to be careful with the activities you're doing, the intensity you're doing it, the weather that you're doing it in. That's the other thing with ketosis. If you're adapted already or you're maintaining, sometimes ketosis will make you lose a lot of water. So there's a tendency for some patients practicing ketosis or nutritional ketosis to be a little bit hypovolemic. Something to do with the compliance of the blood vessels. The blood pressure will drop. So it's usually you'll remedy that by pushing more salt in. And yeah, salt has been notoriously associated with high blood pressure, but in this case, if you're losing weight and you're getting off your medicines and your markers of inflammation, eventually they usually turn, are improving, then you have a little bit of leeway. And I guess that'll lead me to my next thing. With nutritional ketosis, or what Finney calls a well-formulated low-carbohydrate diet, I believe that there are markers that initially change fast. So with weight loss, one is body mass index. And if you can get a DEXA scan, which is a fancy way to tell how much fat you have, it's probably the most accurate. In Illinois, in Rockford, you can do them for $50. It's pretty decent now. But I'm going to get mine and compare it in about a month to an old one I have done. But if you can get that done beforehand, you'll see there's a drop. That's a marker. Also, blood pressure is a marker too. That usually drops. Your random cholesterol, your random glucose levels will probably drop, and your insulin levels will probably drop as well. So these are all markers that'll turn around fast. Now, high sensitivity CRP, which is C-reactive protein, but it's more for inflammation of the blood vessel, that will drop soon. Hemoglobin A1C will take some time to drop. Lipids, which is a controversy. Your lipids, which are the cholesterols, LDL, calculated LDL, and total cholesterol, that takes some time to drop. In fact, there are some people who are called the hyper-responders when they get into practicing ketosis, even if it's mostly plant-based. I have one or two that their cholesterol is jacked up. So it made me a little uncomfortable, but sometimes what I would do with that is I would get, instead of just those 4 basic cholesterols, that's total cholesterol, LDL, HDL, and triglycerides, you'll do the NMR. It's a really fancy one that looks for total LDL particles, particle size, it tells you how much small LDL you have, so ApoE3. So those are all helpful, because if we're losing weight, if we're feeling great, if the blood pressure is lowering, and your satiety is beautiful, but yet your cholesterol is floating high, it does make me nervous. It'll probably make you nervous, especially if you have heart disease in a family. But getting an extra test, because there's many different markers of heart disease, just like I mentioned, there's many different markers of health. And when most of them are chopping down with the initiation of a well-formulated low carbohydrate or an adapted ketosis, it's reassuring, but you have to wait. So I usually wait 6 months, maybe 12 months. I'll find that when people lose weight rapidly, because cholesterol is stored in fat, you'll not only lose weight, hopefully visceral, and not muscle, remember, not muscle, but you'll also free up a lot of cholesterol. And that is spooky when you see it in bloodstreams. So I would usually say wait a little bit, as long as the NMR shows that we're not in critical danger, and maybe a CT scan of the heart, then we can wait until weight loss is stabilized. Once weight loss is stabilized, when you're not burning up as much anymore and you're at a different category of health, then we check a cholesterol fasting 12 hours. And I bet you at that point in time, most people, because you're not releasing all this cholesterol from fat, I bet you at that point in time you'll see a cholesterol drop. Again, unless you're a hyper responder, And sometimes hyper-responders, I think, if they're practicing ketosis or nutritional ketosis, I would just try to move over to not as many saturated fats, which again is tough because you're going to be drinking a lot of olive oil, but that is a way to take care of the small subset of the population. So, Robbie, I hope this gives you a little bit of an idea. Oh, one more thing. The other thing that also gets people into ketosis, meaning a beta hydroxybutyrate of 3 or above, is endurance exercise. So don't forget, if you're doing all this stuff with nutrition, and again, whether you count carbs or macronutrients or not, or just eat to satiety like a lot of the other keto patients do, it's important to throw in or sprinkle in exercise and proper sleep. You have to take care of stress because stress kind of induces a little bit of an insulin response. You got to dial in your protein because you can't lose too much protein, but you can't be on too much protein. If you take too much protein away, muscle loss. If you put too much protein in, it actually, although it's not spectacular, it'll also instigate an insulin response. Not as much as carbohydrate, but it'll still do that. So you have to dial that in, and I think that has to be done by a coach. Fat has to be adapted depending on where you are with your training, where you are with your Herxheimer stage, your adaptive stage, or your maintenance stage. Until you get to another category, then you might want to do something different. Once you drop down to a lower risk category, then sky's the limit. If you get down to a great BMI, even if you're 50 or so, that's where the work of Sarah Hallerberg out of Indiana, Verta Clinic, I'll see if I can put a link down below. Short study, a lot of people, they found that the diabetics did well. So I have to review what the markers change were, but there were some statistically significant changes in hemoglobin A1C, which is awesome. Now, long term, we don't know. I mean, the only long-term practice, and that's when you do centenarian studies, would be in Maasai and the Inuit, and those are two totally different populations that are very rarely going to be practiced by people not in northern Canada or not in Africa. So it just serves as a possibility for long-lived ages to maybe practice that kind of a high fat kind of diet. But I think that with metabolism altogether of the world changing, it is time that we look outside the box at other ways aside from just fasting and a mostly plant-based whole food diet, and this might be one of those ways. Hey, I wanted to do an addendum because I did make a joke about when I was taking in a lot of fat last summer. Well, this is chicharron. Chicharron is pork rinds, and so that is not exactly the healthiest way to become fat adapted. I did also do a video on ketone salts. I didn't talk about that, but I think sometimes when you're trying to get there to avoid that Herxheimer-like reaction, this might help, whether it's the salts or the esters. Esters are super expensive. Check out my video on that. I also have a video on MCT oil. So the reason I wanted to do an addendum is if you are with a standard American diet and you eat average or better than average, just putting fat in your diet is not going to get you into an adaptive ketosis state. You have to be careful. Actually, if you keep a standard American diet and you just add fat, whether it's guacamole or walnuts or my nut butter I showed you before, all you're going to do is still be insulin resistant and just add a ton of fat and hope that you're going to somehow have satiety. You're not going to be satiated because you won't be in ketosis, and all you're going to do is be putting more fat and fuel into your diet and getting heavier. So please, this is my plea to you, is to try to, even if you read on your own, try to get somebody that's well-versed with nutrition, a registered dietitian, somebody that maybe did or is practicing a maintenance ketosis or the well-formulated, the low-carbohydrate diet, or a doctor, perhaps, and test at least. If you're going to invest, you're going to have to do a lot of footwork. So it is worth it, I think, in the long run. As far as how long can you maintain? Well, like I mentioned before, till you drop down in medical category. Medical category could be from a diabetic to a pre-diabetic, from a pre-diabetic to a non-diabetic, or from hypertensive to normotensive, or from a BMI of 30 to maybe 25, whatever the case. When you drop down in a category, you're going to need the next boost up or the next formulation, the next plan to figure out how you're going to continue with this. So again, Robbie, hopefully this gives you a little bit of a understanding. Anybody else, again, that has had a good response with their own ketosis and how you maintain it, please put your comments down below. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next Minute Clinic.